Phasers have been a staple of Star Trek since the original series. They may look similar to typical laser weapons seen in a lot of sci-fi, but they're actually much more powerful and complicated. Starting with archaic lasers, Starfleet weapons evolved into early phase pistols and phase cannons in the 22nd century, which led to the standard handheld and ship-mounted phasers that we've seen since. If you ignore the laser weapons that Pike's crew used in the first pilot, though you can argue that laser was just used at this time as an anachronism for phaser, similar to calling them guns. These devices have been made in many different varieties and have several interesting features that rarely come up in the franchise. Here, we're going to look at some of the most outstanding facts about phaser technology and learn everything we can about Starfleet's main weapon along the way. With all that being said, I'm Bree from TrekCulture, and here are 10 things that you didn't know about phasers. Number 10. Phaser overloads. Phasers require a huge amount of energy to function, and if one is configured to release all of its stored energy at once, it will overload, emitting a high-pitched noise and exploding violently. Someone attempted to assassinate Captain Kirk by hiding a phaser set to overload in his cabin in the episode The Conscience of the King. Upon hearing the distinctive sound, Kirk began ordering an evacuation of the whole deck and calling for a double red alert, which is like twice as bad as a normal red alert. Kirk was eventually able to find the overloading phaser and proceeded to drop it in a waste chute in the corridor, likely murdering several unfortunate red shirts in lower decks. Later, in the episode That Which Survives, Kirk's phaser had its overload triggered while in his hand, forcing him to throw it away like a grenade. An overloading phaser even showed up in the Next Generation episode The Hunted, where a man named Roga Donar tried to use them as bombs aboard the Enterprise D. Number 9. Phasers as survival tools. Starfleet hand phasers have many uses as survival tools. Of course, stranded officers could use them to hunt for food, but they could also be used to heat up rocks, as Wesley did in the episode Final Mission, to keep himself and Captain Picard warm, as well as several other examples. If the phaser was turned up to a higher setting, it could completely vaporize the rock, allowing officers to drill themselves out of a cave if the entrances collapsed. They could also be used in more unique survival situations. In Discovery's first episode, Captain Georgiou used a phaser to reopen a well, letting the water flow again. LaForge used one to melt silver ore into climbing equipment in the Next Generation episode The Enemy to get himself out of a pit. Aside from their use as tools, Starfleet hand phasers got their energy from small power cells, which could be used to power communications equipment and other machines. Number 8. Transporter phasers. In the final episode of Star Trek Picard: The Last Generation, Seven and Rafi's team came up with a new phaser modification. They were able to retake the bridge of the Titan A by connecting their phasers to the transporter systems. Anyone who was shot was sent to the transporter buffer. A standard gun setting probably wouldn't have worked well on these drones, so that was a great way to incapacitate their assimilated crew members without harming them. After retaking the bridge, Seven joked that they may have just invented the portable beam-me-up, but this actually wasn't the first time we've seen something like this in Star Trek. In the Next Generation episode Gambit, Picard was captured by mercenaries who shot him with a transporter-connected phaser to make it appear as though he was vaporized. The crew of the Enterprise all mourned his death before discovering that he was actually still alive. Number 7. Power levels. Hand phaser power levels range from a light zap, enough to clean graffiti off of ships' walls or cause slight skin irritation, all the way up to total vaporization. In between the two extremes, phasers could also burn targets, but more interestingly, the famous stun setting allows users to harmlessly incapacitate most species when in combat. A phaser would need to be modulated carefully to a very specific frequency depending on the mission's requirements. For example, in the DS9 episode Homefront, they found a frequency that was low enough to cause no permanent harm, but high enough to force a changeling to revert to their liquid form. Many may not know that starship phasers can actually be set to stun as well, allowing a ship to stun an entire city in one blast. However, we've only seen this in action once in the original series episode, A Piece of the Action. Number 6. The science of phasers. The exact way phasers work has only been explained on screen through sparse references to beam intensity, nadion particles, and other confusing technobabble. But the Star Trek Next Generation Technical Manual from 1991 went into a bit more detail. According to the reference book, the term phaser was short for phased energy rectification, and a phaser beam was generated by a complicated interaction between plasma and superconducted lithium copper that would cause a so-called rapid nadion effect, dissolving the strong nuclear force in the plasma. From there, a stream of energy would then be fired in pulses through a special superconducting crystal in the emitter. The intensity and frequency of these pulses would determine the effect of the blast, from heating to disintegration. All of this is consistent with what we've seen on screen, apart from the fact that phasers are generally referred to as particle beam weapons, which fire fictional rapid nadion particles, rather than a beam of electromagnetic energy. People have gone into a lot of work trying to describe the way phasers function, but the way they originated was much less scientific. In The Cage, the first Star Trek pilot featuring Captain Pike's crew, Starfleet used laser weapons. These were changed to phasers 2 days into filming the second pilot, and in the reference book The Making of Star Trek, released in 1968, Gene Roddenberry explained that the reason was that he knew people would be yelling "lasers can't do that" at their screens whenever the weapons were used for fantastical things like stunning people or vaporizing targets without damage to the surrounding area. By creating an entirely fictional technology, they were able to avoid scientific inaccuracies by just making it all up. Number 5. Ship phaser variants. In The Next Generation, we got to see a new evolution of the Starship phasers in the form of phaser strips. Phaser strips are long lines of large numbers of phaser emitters that run all across a ship's hull. Energy would travel along these lines and converge on the best possible spot for targeting. A Galaxy-class ship like the Enterprise D came equipped with 12 separate phaser strips, allowing them to fire in almost any direction. We don't know when exactly Starfleet switched from primarily using phaser banks like those on Kirk's Enterprise to phaser strips like in The Next Generation. But the earliest ship we've seen with phaser strips is the Ambassador-class Enterprise C from the year 2344, which we saw in the Next Generation episode Yesterday's Enterprise. Some ships, such as the Defiant, came equipped with pulse phaser cannons which rapidly fired concentrated bursts, as opposed to the steady beams of particles that shoot from standard phaser arrays. Number 4. Handheld phaser variants. Handheld Starfleet phasers can generally be classified into 3 main types. Type 1 phasers are the smallest variants resembling remote controls and are referred to as cricket phasers in the Trek community. Type 2 phasers, on the other hand, more closely resemble the design of a pistol, and Type 3s were more like rifles in appearance. Different phaser types have different power levels and firing modes, but all were capable of both stunning and disintegrating targets. In addition, all types could fire either a steady beam or concentrated blasts. The TV remote design of the Type 1s reinforces the idea that these devices are tools as well as weapons, and the Type 2s are apparently more combat-focused, explaining the gun-like look. In the original series era, Type 1 phasers could actually be slotted into Type 2s, for some reason. Type 3 rifles seem to be employed mostly in times of war. They showed heavy use both during the Dominion War and the Federation's engagements with the Borg. All 3 types of hand phasers have been redesigned countless times in Trek history, but they usually stick to these categories. A phaser bazooka also appeared in a holographic program in the Lower Decks episode Crisis Point, but these probably aren't a real thing, despite how cool they would be. Although there was that one shoulder cannon that Worf sported in Star Trek Insurrection. Number 3. The difference between phasers and disruptors. Phasers and disruptor weapons differ in several key ways. For starters, a phaser can be set to stun, whereas a disruptor is a purely lethal weapon. This difference was an easy way to show the contrast between the violence of alien empires like the Klingons and the comparatively humane Federation. Also, as mentioned earlier, phasers fire pulses of fictional particles called nadions, whereas disruptors seem to be much more blunt, simply disrupting the molecular bonds of their targets. And while both phasers and disruptors are capable of disintegration, disruptors often do so in a much slower and more painful way. However, Starfleet still used disruptors occasionally. In the original series episode Obsession, we learned that Type 2 Starfleet phasers actually have a mode called the Disruptor B setting, suggesting those specific weapons combined both phaser and disruptor tech. Number 2. Wide beams and phaser sweeps. Hand phasers are typically seen firing one narrow, highly accurate beam, but they could be configured for many more firing patterns. By adjusting the width and height of their spread, phasers could actually shoot wide beams or a cone-shaped phaser sweep. Wide beams, also called full spread, could be used to quickly take out a whole room of opponents. Phaser sweeps, however, were most effective when you needed to hit every single part of a room. Starfleet used phaser sweeps throughout DS9, in episodes like Homefront and The Adversary, to locate changeling infiltrators. As we mentioned earlier, these sweeps were set to a specific frequency that would cause any changelings disguised in the room to revert to a liquid. It's likely that these settings aren't typically used in large-scale firefights like the Siege of AR-558, simply because they consume way more power than a direct beam. Number 1. They're totally not guns. In Volume 2, Issue 12 of Star Trek the Magazine, Herman Zimmerman explained that Gene Roddenberry took issue with how some phasers looked similar to guns, specifically the rifles and the pistol grips of the Type 2 phasers. Presumably, he preferred the aesthetics of the Type 1 crickets. This all tracks with Gene's history of promoting nonviolence in the franchise. However, logically, it's all a bit confusing, seeing as even Type 1 phasers were vastly more dangerous than even a modern military tank, despite looking like something you'd use to unlock your car. Of course, the stun setting allows Starfleet officers to non-violently resolve conflicts in a way that a gun never could, but in the wrong hands, they have the potential to cause unimaginable destruction. After all, a single misplaced phaser could disrupt the power balance of an entire pre-warp civilization. Those were 10 things that you hopefully didn't know about phasers. If you enjoyed this video and you want to keep up to date with us, then you can hit that subscribe button to never miss an upload. You can also follow us on social media at TrekCulture on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at TrekCultureYT on Instagram. You can also find me across all those social medias by simply searching Trekkie Bree. But until next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and don't forget to live long and prosper.